what they concluded was that diets with very low carbohydrate availability, so ketogenic diets, did have a positive influence on body composition. So generally a reduction in the percentage of body fat and increasing lean mass. But it did not have an effect on neuromuscular adaptations.
Welcome to Fuel In Sessions, the podcast that delves into the science of nutrition, powered by Fuel In, the AI nutrition app that makes nutrition simple, personalized, and adaptive for anyone who exercises and wants to improve their health and performance. We're going to share expert insights, training tips, strategies, and hopefully a few laughs along the way so you can fuel your best and reach your full potential. I'm your host, Scott Tyndall, and today I am joined by my colleague, Megan Foley. Megan, how you doing?
Good. Just getting reaccustomed to the cold here in Utah. So, good time to be talking about one of the more nutrient-dense macronutrients.
Yeah, it's funny. It's 36 degrees Celsius here today and going to be 41 degrees tomorrow. And I am taking my 17-year-old niece to a heavy metal festival. So who knows how that's going to turn out. And she's into Taylor Swift and Keith Urban. So it could be a hell of a day for all of us involved.
Yeah. Bring some water bottles. You have us beat. Your temperature in Celsius is higher than ours in Fahrenheit. So I guess that means you win.
Yeah. Well, it should be good. It's definitely more in my genre of music and my age bracket. So it's bands like Tool, Weezer, Garbage, Machine Head and whatnot. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how she reacts to it all.
You have to educate the youth,
Well, exactly.
It's important.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but look, enough about old school music and metal festivals. Today we are going to cover the macronutrient that probably, it's sort of left out at the moment, isn't it? We've covered the fueling commandments for women, carbs for women versus men, protein for women versus men in previous episodes on Fuel In Sessions. And, if you haven't listened to them, definitely check them out. There's a lot of information in there and definitely worth listening to. But as I said, there is a macronutrient that seems to have been forgotten recently. Wasn't always the case. Not too long ago, athletes were popping fat gels, going keto, hyping up the advantages of fat as the secret weapon. And, it's still out there, probably not as prevalent. I think we're certainly seeing a bit of a shift in carbs and the potential for what they can do. I guess a bit of a spoiler, we're not going to be recommending sticks of butter mid-race, that's for sure. So if you are a keto advocate or high-fat, low-carb, I wouldn't turn off just yet. I think it's worth listening to what we've got to say, and we're certainly, like all things, open to discussing, fat as a macronutrient and what it can do for the human body and its impact on performance as well as health. And that's really what this is going to be focused on today. So, the key points we're going to cover, the basics of fat, what is it? What foods? Where do you get it from? What are athlete requirements, male versus female? Fat oxidation, fat burning, everyone's favorite topic because apparently it's super important for performance. Dietary manipulation or high-fat diets, and of course, practical recommendations along the way. So let's dive in.
Yes.
Fat basics. Why is dietary fat so crucial for endurance athletes specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think from a athlete perspective, fat is one of our energy sources for lower intensity activities. So lower intensity, we're primarily using more fat. As the intensity climbs, we're using more carbs. So for that reason, it's going to be important for athletes. From a health perspective, it's necessary for the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, right? So your A, your D, your E, your K. you can't actually absorb those without fat intake in your diet. So that's super important just from that. It's going to help protect your vital organs. So that's why, carrying some body fat is important, not just for athletes, but for everyone. And it's also involved in hormone production, right? So cholesterol being a precursor to some of the sex hormones, and that being necessary for health to have those. So, it's important for a lot of reasons, even if we're not talking about it as much as potentially, carbs or protein. But, nonetheless, athletes need to know about it and understand its impacts on their performance and also just overall diet.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the protection of organs. It's probably not as important for maybe endurance athletes, although I guess falling off a bike, maybe it gives you a bit of cushion. Um, it's certainly something that does come up time and again in collision sports, so rugby and ice hockey and sports like that, and football, American football and soccer, because we did see this. Athletes that were really, really lean often just picked up so many musculoskeletal type injuries, contusions and whatnot, I think because they just literally didn't have any padding on them. So I think
Yeah.
it is, maybe not as applicable for endurance athletes, but it's something for the more general population and those types of sports to consider as well.
Yeah, interesting. I always think about it from the perspective of like fragility. So for especially older adults, if you get sick and end up being bedridden, unfortunately, for a couple months, like that extra fat is going to be protective, right? It's going to ensure that you have adequate energy stores to pull from, should anything more serious happen.
Yeah, there is. I have seen some research, and I think it refers to like you're better off being a little bit overweight, heavily muscled, than
Yes.
very, very lean and under muscled. And as you
Yes,
go into,
absolutely.
older age, and it makes complete sense because, there will be a time where you probably do get bed rest as a result of falling over or illness or something. And if you don't have those stores to fall back on, it could be detrimental to, that health span longevity that everyone is craving.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, you mentioned fat is calorically, it's the most dense macronutrient, 9 calories per gram versus, say, carbohydrates and protein, which is 4 calories per gram. But, look, we talk about fat and everyone talks about these grams per kilo and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I mean, fat's a little bit of a different one because you physically can actually eat fat. I mean, you just had Thanksgiving. I'm sure people were eating some turkey fat or duck fat and things like that. But what is fat as a macronutrient, and what are the types of fat? And then what sort of foods, where do we get them from?
Yeah, so there's four, broad categories of fats, right? So you have, well, I guess generally two. So you have your unsaturated fats, which are primarily going to be found in plant sources, and then you have your saturated fats, which are saturated with hydrogens. That's why they call them saturated fats. And that's primarily going to be in your animal sources, although we do find it in some plants like coconut and palm oil. So what's typically thought of as, your healthier fat sources are going to be your unsaturated fats. So that's going to be your monounsaturated fats, which would cover avocado, nuts, olive oil, but then also your polyunsaturated fats, which would be, your walnuts, your flaxseed, your fatty fish. Your omega-3 fatty acids would fall under the polyunsaturated category. So, that's why these are important to include as well. And then the last category would be your trans fats, which as of, I believe it was 2021 in the US, are no longer allowed for companies to add. But these had some pretty negative cardiovascular impacts, and so should be avoided for that reason.
Yeah, the trans fats were typically found in, is it Crisco?
Yes, it's like your partially hydrogenated oils.
It was, yeah, the stuff
Yeah.
that you could leave out on a bench top and it never like changed. And yeah, margarine. I think the easy way of thinking about it is the old form of margarine. And, at the time it was touted as, the next thing in human food technology. But sadly, as it has transpired, that those addition of trans fats actually had negative cardiovascular implications.
Yeah.
It's, same in
Yeah.
Australia. They've outlawed it in Australia as well. So now margarine still exists. And interestingly, some of those margarines are actually backed by the heart foundations because they include things like polyunsaturated fats, which again
Right.
could be vegetable fats. And I think we've seen this in the current social media, the division of polyunsaturated fats are bad for you, seed oils are bad for you, and you can't possibly have canola oil or anything like that. But actually, canola oil is a monounsaturated oil
Right.
in itself.
Yeah.
And so it has this negative connotation, even though it is a monounsaturated fat. And I get it. Like, if you're consuming a hell of a lot of vegetable oil or these seed oils, it, it may have a negative consequence, but it's probably in conjunction with everything else that's going on in that individual's life, as opposed
Right.
to the seed oil or the vegetable oil directly.
Right. It's not that, the inclusion of vegetable oil in your diet is bad. It's probably more likely that the ultra processed foods that people are consuming contain a lot of these oils and they're not getting enough of the omega-3 fatty acids to kind of help balance that. So it's really a misinterpretation of the research with the seed oils are terrible for you. But it's interesting where social media has taken it.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, we're seeing a lot of pushback on that now in the data and pushing back on the cherry picking around the data on those polyunsaturated. And as you pointed out, people will, what's the word? They will criticize, maybe that's not the word I'm searching for, but they would criticize polyunsaturated oils or fats, but then forget or also claim the health benefits of omega 3s. And it's like,
Right.
well, hold on. Omega 3s are polyunsaturated fats. Like, you have omega 3s, you have omega 6s.
Yeah.
You need to
Yeah.
also take that into account. And, your omega 3 polyunsaturated would be considered anti inflammatory as opposed to pro inflammatory.
Correct. I think it's more just getting the right balance of omega-3 to omega-6. And the issue with at least the standard American diet is that no one is consuming omega-3s generally. They're not consuming fatty fish. They're not consuming nuts and seeds. And so, that is really the primary issue.
Yeah, it's and I mean, I don't want to go off too far off tangent too early, but the omega 3s, we talk about this a lot within the Fuel In program. And I know you and I even had a bit of back and forth where I wrote specifically in some of the recommendations that, we're hoping, well, we talk about already, manually with athletes and things, but then starting to bring that in as a coaching level within Fuel In. But, eating fish, at least one serve of fish on a daily basis. And you were like, whew, that's pretty tough. Like, most people won't do that. And then it's like, yes, if you don't hit that, then consider taking an omega-3 supplement, because whilst having a serve of fish every day is likely or is unlikely for majority of people, you still need to get your omega-3s from somewhere. So therefore, a really good quality omega-3 would be recommended nearly on a daily basis in order for you to get those, those polyunsaturated omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at least 2 servings of fatty fish per week is a really great point to shoot for, right? And yes, it's hard to do. Yes, it takes being a bit more intentional about things. And if that's not feasible for you as an athlete, then a supplement can kind of help to fill in some of those gaps.
Yeah, it's I went to the gym yesterday. We did like a hit type session and whatnot. And then I was chatting to a Brazilian guy called Bruno afterwards. And he said, what do you think of sardines? And I said, mate, I love them. And he goes, I can go and get two boxes or tins of sardines for $5. That will give me 38 grams of protein, about, call it 18 grams of fat. But of that, 4 grams of EPA, DHA. And he's like, if I go and buy a protein bar, that will cost
Right.
me $5. I'll get maybe 20 grams of protein, a hell of a lot of chemicals and additives in it. And he's like, it's just a win-win. And then I said, mate, put it on some toast, little side salad next to it. And he's like, you're talking my language. And I was like, I got so inspired. I was like, I went home. As you know, I make my own sauerkraut as well. And so I went home, I put, the whole grain toast out or bread out, packet of or a tin of sardines, sauerkraut on top. I sliced up a red pepper, put that on, a slice of cheese, that little bit of olive oil over the top, little bit of salt, put it in the toasty machine. It sounds absolutely horrific. I said to Mel afterwards, I was like, honestly, this is the greatest like sarnie toasted sandwich I've ever made. And it hit every bucket. It
Yeah.
38 grams of protein. It had at least probably 3 or 4 grams of omega-3s. It had the carbohydrate. It was a red meal. So the 2 slices of toast or bread, that gave me like just under 30 grams of carbs. I was like, and then the sauerkraut, good for the gut. I was like,
Yeah.
I'm winning.
Yeah.
And she was like, it is disgusting, Scott.
Hey, if it meets all the targets and you enjoy it, then absolutely go for it. I personally just had avocado toast with salmon this morning, so there are other options.
Well, that's your
mono
unsaturated fats. It's not going to give you.
Well, yeah, but with salmon on top, I'm covering both. So
oh, you had the salmon, so perfect.
Yeah, felt very well prepared for this episode.
I love it. But look, I think sometimes you just need a little reminder and a little inspiration to, crack open the tin of sardines. Or I told him about pickled herring. He'd never even heard of pickled herring. And I said, well, actually, that is the best source of EPA that you can get from a fish. And he was like, right, I'm going to go and get it. I'm going to eat it. And so I'll feed back what his thoughts are about it.
We'll have to put it in the smart meals.
Yeah, well, actually, I logged it in Smart Meals when I did it, and I called it. I use a little trick there. I put the number 1 before anything I use frequently, so I called it number 1 Scott's Recovery Sarnie, and so that's now logged in my meals in Fuel In. Okay, how much fat do female endurance athletes need?
Yeah, so the research doesn't actually give a set gram per kilogram amount. I've seen it one thrown around a few times in a research piece here or there, but generally the recommendation for female athletes is around 20% of total calories. Now, is that recommendation appropriate? I think we'll probably get into that question a little bit deeper. But that recommendation kind of falls within the recommendation for general population, which is 20 to 35% of total calories.
Okay. So do women need more dietary fat than men?
That's kind of one that is commonly thrown out there just because women tend to have higher body fat percentages than men. But no, there's no reason that women should consume more fat day to day for that reason.
Okay. So you're saying, look, the general population, if we just lump men and women together, general recommendation, 20 to 35% of calories.
Mm-hmm.
However, not necessarily appropriate for athletes because athlete base guideline is what, closer to sort of the 20% of diet or 1 gram per kilo as a starting point.
Correct. So most of the recommendations that are out there will tell female athletes, all athletes, around 20% of total calories. But I think, some of the more targeted research will recommend around 1 gram per kilogram per day, like you mentioned. The reason for this being, if we have endurance athletes like we do using the Fuel In program who are doing significant training volumes, they need to ensure that they're getting enough carbs and protein to support that. And while fat is still important, generally the 1 gram per kilogram per day seems to be optimal for good health.
So you mentioned that this 20 to 35% may not be enough because it doesn't take into account high volume of training. Like, what have you seen in terms of upper limits of fat intake for endurance athletes? Yeah, and what is that typically based on?
Well, I don't think it's not getting enough. I mean, we do run into that for some athletes, but a high fat intake can make it more difficult for athletes to get in enough carbohydrate, for athletes to get in enough protein, right? And those are going to be, really important for energy during your training sessions, especially your higher intensity training sessions, and also your recovery and your maintenance of lean mass. So, it's not that athletes need to go higher than this 20 to 35% of their total calories. It's that they need to make sure that they're getting in enough carbs, they're getting in enough protein to support the training that they're doing.
Yeah, and that's where and even with as we start to see and this is why percentages is often a bad thing, isn't it, as well? Because it's the total calories that matter. It's the same with the carb loading. If you went off a 60%, requirement of carbs for the carb load and you're only taking in 1,600 calories, well, you're not going to get the minimum 8 grams per kilo. So yeah, it's sort of similar with the fat, isn't it? Because we have, especially as we, are playing around with fuel in engine V2, and even comparing that to V1, we see some athletes with, intakes of 1.8 grams per kilo for
Right.
those who have very high training volumes of sort of 25 hours plus. And so they're taking in, let's call it 150 grams of fat per day, which, by anyone's measure, that's high fat. However, it's not high fat without high carb and without
Sure.
high protein, because we're just trying to get the total amount of calories into the athlete because that's actually what they require.
Yeah, I think it's because athletes are generally, if their requirements are 4,000 calories, 5,000 calories plus, right? Yes, their intake of carbohydrate is going to be higher, but unless they're just eating white rice, unless they're eating maple syrup or honey and jam, food contains a mix of macronutrients, and so the fat and the protein are going to creep up higher just to support the intake of enough carbohydrate.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, that does remind me though, and this has been flagged to me multiple times. You brought up most food will have some fat in it, but there is one magical food out there that only has carbohydrates, very little protein, and no fat, and that would be fruit. And it's been flagged with me because I've been getting sent all these, Instagram reels and things, and it's about people saying like fruit does not make you fat and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, I said that 2 years ago. Come on, guys. Like I was on Triathlon Taryn's podcast and we were talking about like, you've never seen anyone who's eaten too many oranges or too many bananas who's obese.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, like majority of athletes probably don't eat enough fruit, first and foremost.
Right.
But as to your point, most food will contain protein, fat, and carbohydrates in it. And so as total caloric requirement goes up, we have to bump protein and fat consistently with that as well. So, and I think that's a really lovely upgrade to fuel in engine V2 is we incrementally increase protein and fat. So athletes may see actually some days differences on protein and fat, which doesn't necessarily happen in V1 at the moment. If you are one of these athletes training, let's call it 25 hours plus, and you are taking in 4,500 plus calories, you probably will have some differences in protein and fat on those days because your food intake is just going to contain more of it. And if we don't do that, you're not going to, you're always going to be over on your protein and fat targets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the message is that we want athletes to eat real food, right? Like you could technically, keep that fat intake lower by eating some of these like really more simple refined carbohydrates, but is that actually beneficial? It's probably better for your health to, just get a wider variety of food that's going to contain some fats and some protein.
Correct. Food first, but not food only.
Yes.
Yet the focus definitely with Fuel In is, let's focus on food, guys. Let's get good quality foods in, carbohydrates, vegetables, fruits, layer it in, whole grains, rices, breads, things like that. Then use some of these sports supplement formulations, especially in training when the intensity is there. But let's not rely on, maltodextrin and fructose and all that on a daily basis because that could have negative health impact.
Nobody wants a maltodextrin evening snack. That's just not.
Unless it's carb loading day.
Yeah, unless it's right before an event, sure, absolutely go for it. But otherwise, there's probably some better options out there for folks.
So, what if athletes are consuming too little fat? What are some of the
Yes.
negative consequences that could happen?
Yeah, so we do see it with female runners that are, often or, often sometimes their fat intake is really low, whether that's intentional or unintentional. But that has been correlated with a higher risk of injury. So, not cause, but correlation there. Um, I think part of that is that a low fat intake is going to contribute to potentially an insufficient calorie intake, right? So it could be a part of low energy availability that we need to take into account. Anecdotally, you'll see more menstrual disturbances with women with very low fat intakes. And this, again, could be potentially related to the fact that fat is a precursor to some of those sex hormones. So that's always something to be on the lookout for. And then, maybe it's not an issue, but something that I feel like used to come up more frequently, and we still see with maybe some of the older generations of athletes, was just the thought that fats are really bad, right? The low fat diets of especially the 80s and 90s, right? Where you had low fat products everywhere. And in order to make those foods tasty, you would replenish that with some sort of sugars. And that's not necessarily beneficial to health either.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. It's funny, isn't it? Because people will like to, label, well, one thing is what's causing it. You mentioned the injury rate with the athletes, and it's like, well, is it the reduction in fat, or is it actually the fat just contributes to a low energy intake, and therefore, yes,
Yeah.
fat is responsible for that, but it also layers in because you're now in low energy availability constantly or chronically, and that then predispose you. So it's that interrelationship that I think is always overlooked. And, it could be like, because it is a precursor to these, female hormones in general. Males will also have, estrogen and testosterone as well. But like, yeah, I think it's always so black and white that it's not,
Yeah.
people don't think about the interrelationship of how these different macronutrients and calories actually relate to the individual athlete, and how that can contribute to either positive or negative, health consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often tell athletes, especially if they have weight concerns, whether that's, they're concerned about losing weight, or maybe they are trying to lose weight, because fat is the most calorically dense macronutrient that we have. Fluctuations in that are going to cause big energy swings, right? So if your fat intake is really low, that's going to really decrease your total energy intake. If your fat intake is higher, it's going to increase it. So it's just something to really be aware of with athletes. And depending on what your goals are, modifying that within a healthy range of intake is going to be important.
Cool. So we've discussed the need, well, what fat is, the needs of fat for female male athletes and endurance athletes in particular. I guess the burning question, a lot of people, when we talk about fat and when people hear fat, they start talking fat oxidation, respiratory exchange rate, your RER, your sex differences. Like, where does this sit? Are women better fat burners than men?
Well, I guess we should back up and explain what RER
Oh,
is, right?
sorry. Go with that first. Sorry.
Yeah, so RER is a measurement of the fat utilization that's currently, or energy, what's the word I'm looking for? The macronutrient utilization that you're using in the current time, right? So a lower RER means you're using more fat for fuel, versus a higher RER means you're using more carbohydrate.
Yep. And just,
Yes.
I think I said rate, respiratory exchange ratio.
There we go.
I
we'll
believe
get it all together
is the
eventually.
term. Sorry, I said rate, not ratio. So apologies there.
Yeah, so that's what RER is referring to. It's referring to what fuel source is being utilized for energy expenditure.
Yeah, and
So
how would someone, people will say, "Oh, I'm a great fat burner," or "I'm a terrible fat burner. I need to improve my fat oxidation." How does someone actually go about understanding their RER or the respiratory exchange ratio?
you would have to go into a lab and have it measured. So that would probably be the easiest way to have a better understanding of what's going on there.
Yeah, and an RER, like give an example of someone who is an extremely good fat burner at rest. What would that number look like?
So if we're mostly using fat, uh, it's going to be zero point 0.7 as an RER. And if we're primarily using carb or exclusively using carb, it's going to be 1 as the number that's shown.
And in your experience, and some people will see, they'll have an RER of zero point 0.8 or something like that, 0.81. In your experience, yeah, that's pretty good though, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think it's important to remember that RER is going to fluctuate a lot based off of a number of variables, which we will discuss here in a second. So it's not just a set number that you have and that's your rate for forever and ever. There's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah, and that assessment as well, obviously it can be impacted by, if you go in fasted or have a meal before, what the type of meal is, whether you did exercise, are you fully rested, blah, blah, blah. I know Alan and I covered this in a previous podcast that, I definitely recommend if you want to understand getting a metabolic test done, then definitely listen to that episode because how you do the test is going to have a significant impact on what the results are. And if you don't do the test properly or the people administering the test don't do it properly, then the numbers are absolutely useless.
Yes. Yeah. Usually when I'm presented with someone who has one of these tests done, I'm like, well, did you follow a protocol prior to the test? And they're like, well, no. So, okay,
Brilliant.
well, maybe we start there.
Exactly. So if we now know, okay, RER or RQ, respiratory quotient, is the other way that it's referred to. 0.7 being you're an amazing fat burner, probably doesn't exist generally unless you're probably in a keto state. Even then, I don't think they'd be exactly 0.7. They're probably 0.75 or something like that. Versus 1.0 or above, which means you're exclusively using carbohydrates. Are women better fat burners than men? I.e., do they have a lower number typically than men?
So typically, women will have a lower RER compared to men at sub maximal intensities. And the thought is that this is a effective estrogen, so estrogen causing more fat burning capabilities. But I think it's important to remember that it depends on how you quantify the measurement, right? So women are generally lower on RER, but men are typically burning more fat just because their absolute exercise intensity is higher.
Because their power output is higher.
Correct. Yes.
It comes back to that all the time, doesn't it? It's like relative intensity, absolute intensity. You might potentially, use or have higher fat oxidation. But if you are one of those females that actually has pretty low power output, you may not be burning that much anyway.
Correct. Yeah. So it needs to be, viewed with a wide lens when looking at this. But yes, generally women have lower RERs compared to men at similar exercise intensities.
Okay, and because they've got a lower RER, they potentially have a higher fat oxidation. It's that inverse that often confuses
Correct.
people. The lower the number, the higher the ability to utilize fat. The
Yes.
higher the number, the less fat you're utilizing. That's probably the
Yes,
easiest
that's
way of
correct.
describing it. Okay, menopause. Does it impact RER in women?
Yeah, interestingly, we see RER shift upward in postmenopausal women. And again, this is thought to be a cause of estrogen, right? I mean, when women go through menopause, there's now a lack of estrogen. And so their RER postmenopause tends to more similarly look like the RERs of men in that case.
What's the impact of that for menopausal women? They hear that and they're like, oh my God, I don't use fat as well as I used to when I was young. I now, what, use carbs a little bit better?
I think it's important to think about when are we when are we prescribing carbs, or when are we feeding female athletes, right? Especially postmenopausal athletes. And if you are now slightly worse at using fat as a fuel source, I think that makes in-session fueling a bit more important for those women, right? Especially to feel good during training, which should be the primary goal. So ensuring that carb intake in and around training is adequate to support the effort that they're doing, I think is going to make that training a whole lot more enjoyable.
Yeah, I love that. And that's, again, if we come back to, what we are doing with Fuel In, that's exactly that. And I think that's the reason when I get messages, and I know you've had a lot of messages and Alan has as well, from menopausal women who are like, I've never had carbs during a session.
Yes.
Now that I'm having them, I feel amazing. And then secondly, my recovery from that session is amazing. And therefore, I'm not raiding the fridge after the session and undoing everything that I just did in the session.
Yes.
And I think it's that. And it's not, you can go into the science and everything, but it's like, end of the day, the absolute intensity, the power that you're pushing results in work being done, kilojoules, calories being burnt. If that session is of significant duration and you require some in-session fueling in it, then you will be supplied that relative to your absolute intensity, the power being put out. And that's not going to leave you in a hole. And you're going to feel great. And that doesn't, that's irrespective if you're menopausal, perimenopausal, or eumenorrheic. Like if you've got a normal menstrual, we're going to do the same thing. Yep. And lo and behold, it works. It doesn't matter where you are in your menstrual cycle phase of life. It works for women and it works for men. It's the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you were an athlete before you went through menopause, and you're an athlete now still after menopause, right? And so treat yourself as one. And that means following these general guidelines that we know work and are going to be beneficial to your performance.
I think there's just so much confusion there and so much fluff around it because you're a woman, you need something different. And actually, no, it like someone said, who was it? A female researcher said it to me, where she was like, the thing is, women aren't men, but women have never trained like men. Women have never been told they need to train like men. They've always been told train like a woman. And it's sort of like this, like, I had to go, what? And it's like so true. It's like lift little weights, little purple weights or pink weights. Do a little thigh master here and there. And it's like, actually pick up a barbell and do 4 sets of 12 with a 2 rep in reserve like you would give to a man and see what happens. And you know what? They benefit from it. And it's like, train like a man. And I'm not being sexist here. I'm saying train as in the way a man is being told to train is based on evidence. And I think the problem here is that probably the evidence for women around training, and I'm talking specifically around strength training here, is that I think unfortunately a lot of women were told, well, you shouldn't be lifting like that. And now there's this big movement, isn't there, of women actually going, well, F that, I'm going to like do a 3 rep max and I'm going to deadlift 150 kilos. And you look at these women who do this training the same as their male counterparts, they start to see the results in their physique and their performance.
Yep. It's a rabbit hole we could probably go down for another 2 hours because it's something that I feel very passionate about. I mean, the messaging to women in sports, whether that's through coaching or federations or the access that they have to facilities or coaching or, there's a whole lot there. We could get into a lot.
We'll do that on another one. We'll get into the pink and purple. We'll get into the pink and purple psychology of female training.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep moving. So we covered exercise intensity, availability, influence, fat oxidation, men, women. That's good. Okay, dietary manipulation. I think this is a big one as well. Like Let's talk keto. Keto for women. Is it
Yes.
beneficial?
So there was a systematic review that came out earlier this year that was looking at nutritional strategies to optimize health for female athletes. And they did look at keto studies. And what they concluded was that diets with very low carbohydrate availability, so ketogenic diets, did have a positive influence on body composition. So generally a reduction in the percentage of body fat and increasing lean mass, but it did not have an effect on neuromuscular adaptations. So they were not performing better, but their body composition was better.
So you look better, but you perform like shit.
So you may have a certain body composition, but you are not a better athlete by any means. No.
And I think, look, this is a really important point because I know there's going to be keto advocates or high fat people who will say, see, bingo, systematic review that said, go low carb, keto, high fat diet, and you're going to positively improve body composition. Great. If you're a swimsuit model and that is your pure goal of looking aesthetically better for summer, absolutely. Well, not absolutely, potentially going low carb, high fat could have a positive influence on you. The caveat to that is if you are focusing on body composition in the off season to improve performance in the in season, then that is not going to have a positive effect on that. You may look better, but you're not going to perform better when it comes to the crunch.
Right. And I think if we're looking at body composition in a vacuum, right? Like if we're looking at looks only, okay, sure, maybe keto is a good idea. But we haven't yet discussed the health implications of a ketogenic diet. And so I think that is also something to discuss and a reason to potentially reconsider if this was a diet that you were looking to follow.
Yeah, and the caveat also with that systematic review, it was looking at strength-based athletes, as it wasn't actually talking about endurance athletes either. So not only that, you're not even going to lift heavier weights in the gym if that's your bag, and you're trying to get stronger and improve with movement, efficiency. You're not even going to get that. You're just probably going to look a little leaner. So really it comes down to if you're that vain and that's what you want, then
what your goal is, right?
Yeah, what your goal is, I guess that's where it is. But if we're, look, majority of our listeners are going to be endurance athletes, I think it's just something to consider. If we talked about RER and fat oxidation, and we will talk about what are the modifiable factors to improve that. And yes, diet is one of those. However, if you do change your diet drastically, yes, it could improve body composition, but it may not improve performance. It certainly could have a negative impact on health, which we're about to discuss, and ultimately not really put you any closer to your performance goals in the coming year. So anyway, that's where we are. So the next one's close to my heart, and excuse the pun on that, but that's exactly what this is referring to. So as most listeners are aware, I did this keto study, which I ended up dropping out of after about 8 weeks because I just couldn't do it anymore. But one of the negative consequences of that was my lipid profile went pretty haywire and went through the roof, which was very discouraging for me, and actually sort of had to take a few deep breaths around that because my uncle had died of heart disease, where my grandfather died of heart disease. It's obviously something that I'm aware of within the family that, adverse lipoproteins could have a negative impact on my cardiovascular health. So I then pointed this out to the researchers, and I was quickly hit with a paper that was titled Elevated LDL Cholesterol with a Carbohydrate Restricted Diet, Evidence for a Lean Mass Hyperresponder Phenotype, published in Current Developments in Nutrition. I was like, what the hell is a lean mass hyperresponder? It sounds awesome. I think I reached out to you, reached out to Alan McCubbin, and it was pretty interesting looking into it. And I'll definitely give my views on what I think this paper is and any of the other subsequent papers around it. But can you just explain what this is, Megan?
Yeah, so this paper talks about this phenotype of the lean mass hyperresponders, and they looked at almost 550 adults, and roughly half were female. I believe 45% of the population was female. And they had these adults follow a carb restricted diet. And what they found was that there was an inverse relationship between a person's BMI and the change in LDL cholesterol that they saw when they underwent this carb restricted diet. So BMI kind of being a standard measure here for, leanness, right? Like BMI is not a direct measure of body fat percentage, but that was what they were using here. And what they saw was the people that were lower BMI had the highest LDL levels. And this was really interesting because, oftentimes we see overweight populations go on a low carb diet to try to lose some weight and become more healthy, and they don't see these changes, but these changes were occurring for these low BMI folks.
And what were the changes? Like what do they, to be classified in this hyperresponder state? Like you talked about BMI and how we saw this change in LDL cholesterol, but what were the markers that they sort of typically saw?
Yeah, so they typically saw this rapid increase in LDL cholesterol, and so the phenotype classification says LDL cholesterol over 200. HDL cholesterol would also increase. This was usually over 80, but their triglycerides would be very low or lower still, roughly under 70 milligrams per deciliter. So this is very separate to, those with metabolic syndrome. Those who were very overweight would have very different lipid profiles to these folks.
Yeah. For me, like I obviously, you look at these cutoffs and what they were doing, and I'll just give my take on this and based on what I saw. So I saw like my cholesterol, so total cholesterol went up by about 20%. And this is over a 4.5 week period, just to put it in context as well. So it went from 190 to 244. That's your cholesterol actually wasn't in there as a marker, but I just want to make note of that. So my LDL cholesterol went from 95 to 165, which was a 40% increase. It didn't quite hit the 200. And then when you actually read through the study, it's like, okay, they're not hard cutoffs. It's just sort of the observed sort of numbers they saw. So I didn't quite hit the 200. HDL cholesterol did go up, but it only went up by about 10%. Triglycerides dropped massively. So they dropped by 75%, which fits with, again, that energy restriction, carbohydrate restriction, relying on fat as a fuel source. But what was really concerning and what's not mentioned in any of these studies is ApoB, apolipoprotein B, which if you listen to any of the experts around cardiac health, they're all pointing towards ApoB as being one of the key lipoproteins that could be a cardiometabolic risk factor. Now, I had worked really hard to get mine down to 85 or 0.85 for those in the Southern Hemisphere. It shot up to 102, so up 18, call it 17, 18%. Sadly, I got reassessed, in October. It's sitting at 109. So it's actually gone up a little bit more since then. It hasn't dropped back down. It's stayed relatively stable, despite going back into what I consider a normal diet. Now I will get my bloods done again 6 months later and see how long does it take hopefully for that to come down. But being above 100 is considered a risk factor. What I haven't had done, and which I have previously had done, is a calcium score. I've always had a 0 calcium score. I've never had a CTCA. Would have been interesting to have maybe a baseline on soft plaque through the CTCA coronary angiogram, and compare that to maybe an updated one. But, hopefully I don't have to do that. Hopefully my calcium score is still 0 if I go and get that done. But I just think it's like, it's one of those ones where it feels like this is a justification. Let's create a new phenotype because you've gone on a high-fat diet. We see the risk factors that are well known and discussed in the literature around cardiometabolic health as being risk factors, things like ApoB and LDL cholesterol. But because you're lean, athletic, you've got good fasting insulin and blood sugars and things like that, hey, it's not a risk. But for me, I see this. I went on a high-fat keto diet, and it has pushed all of those risk factors up. And I struggle with the justification around it.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems quite challenging. And I think, you know, one of the main issues with this study that I saw was that they didn't, measure saturated fat intake, right? So you would imagine someone on a low carb diet is probably drastically increase their saturated fat, which is going to have an impact on LDL. You also mentioned, needing to increase fat trafficking. So you're going to have potentially a mechanism behind this, more VLDL production leading to higher LDL. And yeah, LDL alone being a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So it's kind of scary.
Yeah. And I mean, interesting again, like I think back to the education material around what to consume on the keto diet. It was MCT oil. It was coconut oil, both saturated fats. Like, I mean, I typically will tell any athlete who has higher LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, to review all their products that they're consuming. And if any of them have palm oil or coconut oil in, to remove that. If you are consuming coconut oil on a daily basis, remove it from your diet, replace it with extra virgin olive oil or avocado oil. And typically you do see a reduction in that LDL cholesterol if they don't have the genetic, predisposition to non-modifiable cholesterol or profile. So,
Oh yeah.
like I don't know. It really stood out to me that these diets that people will push, not only do they potentially not improve your performance, but underneath it all could have a very negative impact on some cardiometabolic risk factors.
Yes.
So that's where I sort of sit with it.
Absolutely. And I think if we are talking dietary strategies to reduce LDL, it's like you mentioned, reducing saturated fats or replacing them with unsaturated fats. And then the addition of fiber in the diet, which is going to come from carbohydrates. So another reason not to avoid carbs in this instance.
Yeah, no, I agree. Agree completely. Well, hopefully, we'll come back and circle back on that next time I get a blood test and check out my lipid panels, and hopefully everything's back and I'm not going to die of a heart attack anytime soon. So we've covered dietary manipulation. What about other things that could impact fat oxidation? And I'm going to refer to a paper which was published 2022, and it's Jeff Rothschild et al. Factors influencing substrate oxidation during submaximal cycling, a modeling analysis. This is Jeff and Dr. Dan Plews, our friends across the channel over in New Zealand. And do you want to give us a little insight into what this study looked at and who was involved and what was being investigated?
Yeah, so this was looking at different things that could modify an athlete's RER. So a lot of
who was involved first? Sorry, who was involved
in the study?
Yeah. So what were they looking? What type of athlete were they looking at, and how many studies were involved?
So they were looking at cyclists only, and they looked at, I think it was 106 studies used in the analysis. So pretty broad web there. And they were looking at these different factors that could impact RER. So, there's been a number of articles out there that have shown these different variables that can impact it, some of them being modifiable, some of them not being modifiable. But they specifically were looking at things like exercise intensity, workout duration, muscle glycogen levels, an athlete's daily intake of carbohydrates and fat, and then some of those non-modifiable or less modifiable things like fitness level, sex, and age.
And what you mentioned, like the substrate oxidation variance, like what was the variance?
Yeah, so they saw that there was I think it was 60% variance in substrate oxidation, but things that were modifiable. So, for example, muscle glycogen, carbohydrate intake, fat intake, those factors only explained around 30% of the variation that they saw.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, isn't it? So the other 60 odd percent, that cannot be controlled on a daily basis. And
Right.
we hear athletes talking and talking and talking and obsessing over fat oxidation, yet only 30% is potentially controllable. And
Right.
so comes back to what we said, maybe genetics plays a large part in this as well.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, genetic variation, type 1 muscle fiber type, mitochondrial enzymes, right? Like all of that is going to have some sort of impact here. And you can't do anything about it, unfortunately.
yeah, I mean, and as you mentioned, age and sex. I mean, we're just
Yeah.
getting older, so unfortunately we can't change that. And that your RER is going to change as you get a bit older. You can't change your sex. Well, you can, but it's probably not going to have any impact on RER if you do go and get that done. So if we talk about those modifiable factors, you mentioned, okay, so exercise intensity.
Hmm.
How does that impact men versus women in terms of RER?
Yeah. So for both men and women, as exercise intensity increases, you're going to see an increase in RER. So carbohydrate utilization is going to go up as exercise intensity goes up.
Workout duration.
So workout duration, the longer the duration of the activity, RER is actually going to shift downward. So you're going to see a greater fat oxidation to support the longer activity sessions.
And I remember hearing Jeff talk about this, and I've heard Dan talk about it as well. They sort of pinned this one as one of the biggest factors that athletes can modify. And time in the saddle is
Yes.
probably one of the biggest driving factors in improving fat oxidation. So 1 hour of cycling probably ain't going to do it. So 2 hours, 3 hours, you being out there, all that. And the cool thing is you can still suck back on carbs if you're in these long duration, even zone 2 sessions and still improve fat oxidation.
Yeah, I think it's about appropriate carb intake, right? That's what we always
For
talk about
sure.
with fuel, and it doesn't mean doing a 4 hour fasted ride. It means providing enough carbs to complete the work efficiently.
Yeah, and that, again, fuel and engine V2, your zone 2, let's say you've got an FTP of 180, your zone 2, you're pushing 100, 120 watts. Okay, you're probably going to get 30 to 40 grams per hour of carbs, somewhere around there. The other athlete who, let's call it you or Sky or Holly, you've got an FTP, I don't know, what, 280, something like that.
I
Let's
wish.
just say
I
280.
wish right now.
But you're pushing in zone 2, let's call it 170, 180 watts. Your zone 2 carb fueling is probably going to be closer to 60 or 70 grams an hour, even if it's in zone 2. And that's going to be the difference there. But you still can improve fat oxidation even with that carb intake if the duration of the training or the session is enough. And that's really cool.
Absolutely.
I think that's so cool about the modeling of this. And what we have seen in some of the studies, the Peloton studies, where they were consuming 90 grams an hour, but because they were going for 4.5 hours, they still had max fat oxidation with max carb oxidation.
Yeah, yeah. I think nutrition can help you to do the work that's required to get the fat oxidation levels that you're reaching for, right? So, it's the nutrition needs to follow the activity here for that to be important.
Yeah, it's probably a good reminder for me. I think at the moment with 3 kids and everything else going on in my life, my bike sessions are limited to about an hour, and they're definitely. I don't think there's too much fat burning going on in amongst it because the intensity is probably too high as well. But I've just got to accept that. Like the training I'm doing is more geared towards trying to improve high end. I'm trying to improve VO2 max and things like that because that's what I see as a limiter, as opposed to my RER, which is typically, I think, 0.71 or 72. Like it's actually really good. And so again, like you don't have to focus on fat oxidation all the time if it's not actually the weakness in what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one piece that goes into performance, but it's not actually a measure of performance, right? And I have the same conversation with athletes about weight all the time, right? Like, yes, it has an effect, but it's not the end all be all here. So, if this is an area where athletes need to improve, you've gotten some tests done and you can say, oh, my fat burning is really low. Okay, great. Let's do some more, zone 2 sessions. Let's try to work on fixing this. But that's not going to be the case for everyone, and that's not going to be the performance limiter for all athletes.
Well, I mean, I think we were joking about it, wasn't it? It's like you don't get a medal at the end of the race for being the best fat burner.
Right.
Like, I mean, again, like if I'm ever going to get under 3 hours on this bloody marathon, it isn't because my RER's gone up or down, sorry, and in my improvement in fat oxidation. It's going to be because actually my threshold's gone down, that I can
Yes.
actually go faster and be able to keep doing that for an extended period of time. Like I couldn't care about my fat oxidation at this point in time.
Yeah, and I mean for your high intensity races, right? Like you're primarily using carbohydrates as your energy source anyway. So like let's make sure that's correct. Let's make sure that's on point and you've practiced it and it's comfortable and there's your performance outcome just waiting for you right there.
I look at every 70.3 now. I mean, if we're talking elite professionals, and they're finishing it in 3 hours. I mean, who cares? Like, you just want to have really good carb oxidation
Yeah.
to be able to go that quick. And even age groupers now, I mean, 5 hours used to be a target, like a pretty respectable time for age groupers to get under. And it's like now, if you're not probably under 4.5, you're probably way back. So, it's speed is the key at the moment. Speed kills, and that speed kills comes with carbohydrate, intake and oxidation and utilizations.
Yeah, and I think this stuff is important for athletes to understand, right? Like you can modify your RER if you want to based off of some of these factors. Um, and that's very interesting, but it's for most not the make or break to them being a good athlete or having a good race day performance.
Exactly. Let's wrap it up. I know we're probably on the hour or thereabouts. What are your take home messages? What would you say?
Um, I would say probably the information that was the most boring of this podcast, which is the most basic, is the most important, right? So, getting enough good fats in your diet is going to be important. So getting enough of those monounsaturated fats, those polyunsaturated fats, your omega-3s from your fatty fish, your krill oil if you're a vegan, that's gonna be really important. Unfortunately, cardiovascular disease is the number one cause of death worldwide. So, it's something to consider if you are thinking about making some pretty drastic diet changes, specifically a really low carb diet. I think it's something important to think about. Do you have any points you would like to add here?
No, I think I think that point is like, you can manipulate fat oxidation, yet it might not make you perform better. It might make you look better.
Yeah.
And if you do it in a way that restricts like other macronutrients, i.e. carbs, it could come at a health cost. And so like I think fat is such an interesting macronutrient. Similar, I guess, protein and carbs are interesting as well. But I think there is so much division over fat and how important it is and what it can do. But I think what appears to be clear that if you go on a drastic reduction of one macronutrient at the expense of another in terms of boosting that up, it could have some serious health implications on you. And also result in probably detrimental performance, yet make you look a little better. So really, I guess it's whatever your purpose is. If you just want to look good, but potentially, you know, have a cardiac event, go for it in the long term. But, you know, that I think it's just think about why you're doing what you're doing.
Yes.
As Megan explained, as I talked about, like, you can still improve fat oxidation whilst eating carbohydrates through some easily modifiable factors, duration of exercise being one of the easiest, controlling the amount of carbohydrates around the intensity of the session. And that's exactly what we do with Fuel In. We won't give you carbs unnecessarily. It's going to be based on the intensity of the session. And now with Fuel In Engine V2, your actual output is also going to then dictate the amount of carbohydrates that you're getting relative to your power output. So don't be carb phobic. Don't necessarily be fat phobic. It's all about, I hate to say it, moderation. It's not moderation. It's more being specificity.
Yeah.
You take in the amount of fat to meet your caloric requirements. You take in the amount of carbs to meet your caloric requirements. And then the timing of the carbohydrates is going to be based on the duration and the intensity of that session.
Yes. Yes. Couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, any sort of performance is going to be built on a foundation of good health. So that
Amen to that. Amen to that. A healthy athlete is a high-performing athlete, and we've said it since day one at Fuel In. So eat your food first, not always food only. Eat your carbs, eat your fat, eat your protein. Just do it in a way that we recommend to you, and everything will be fine. Megan, as always, awesome to chat. Love this one. It's funny, you know, we took a long time to prepare for this one because we were like, oh, is there much to talk about? But there's actually a hell of a lot to talk about. And in the end, we've talked more in this one than even the carbs or the protein. So thank you for your time, for your dedication. I know all the athletes love, you know, working with you and your level of knowledge and expertise. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think if we didn't hit keto and at least, you know, touch on seed oils, people were going to be mad. So I'm glad we got those in there.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I'll catch you later. Thank you.
Bye.